So here we are again, Navigator Live. We're going to be talking about some nutrition stuff today. Before we get started for real, I do want to just throw one thing out there. You guys know I try not to get too political at all in the group or anything like that. However, this is what we call National Virtual Lobbying Week for my professional association, the American Association for Respiratory Care. We take a week out every year. We take a couple of days and actually send RTs, respiratory therapists from all over the country, to Washington to lobby directly. But we also realize that there's a lot of strength in numbers, so we try to do a lot of stuff virtually too, with phone calls and with emails and all that kind of thing, trying to target a lot of our elected representatives to try to hit various topics in respiratory care. This year our theme is actually one that I'm very much on board with. It's general enough so that we have a very good chance of success getting our respiratory therapy name out there, so to speak, and being able to advocate for a lot of our community. And that goal is to make sure that any potential legislation that comes out this year regarding telehealth or you doing medical education and or diagnostics remotely, either through the computer or over video links, that sort of thing. A lot of those things are, to put it simply, respiratory therapists cannot provide those things in a lot of cases because we're not reimbursed for those services through Medicare. In some states we can do it through Medicaid, but of course many people living with COPD are on Medicare, and it makes it difficult to access those services. And it's kind of a double whammy because a lot of those people who would most benefit from telehealth are those who also live in places where it's difficult to get to a physician or to have the services available. So we want to add respiratory therapy to those services, to that list of services that Medicare will reimburse for. And in addition to that, we also are hoping to insert legislation into the appropriation bill that pays for the Department of Health and Human Services to require the CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, to do a claims analysis for COPD claims so that we can have more evidence to bolster our claims that respiratory therapy can improve the lives of people living with COPD when we're allowed better access to those patients. So if everybody would take just a moment in the day today to go to this website, capwiz.com/AARC/issues. The AARC has come up with several kind of pre-drafted letters, depending on whether you're a respiratory therapist, a student, a physician, a respiratory patient, or just a general supporter of our cause. And you can basically, all you need to do is fill in your name and your address and your zip code, and the system will automatically be able to send this pre-drafted letter to your senators and to your local representative, to the U.S. House of Representatives. It can take as little as 30 seconds. You are, of course, able to edit the letter as much as you like, but it does have some very good boilerplate text. Basically talking about we can ensure Medicare beneficiaries with chronic respiratory disease have access to that expertise through telehealth, and again to conduct a data analysis of COPD claims in various healthcare settings. For the actual patient letter, basically it says, I am your constituent and I suffer from chronic respiratory disease. In order to expand opportunities for me to receive the care I need, I am writing today to ask you to make sure respiratory therapists are included as telehealth providers in any telehealth legislation introduced this year. I have seen firsthand the difference a respiratory therapist has made in my life. They are skilled in respiratory diseases and can teach me the tools that I need to take care of myself, especially how to recognize the symptoms and triggers of my pulmonary disease that help me stay healthy, help me stay healthier, and prevent me from having to be admitted or readmitted to a hospital. Being able to provide respiratory services via telehealth communications also expands opportunities for other patients with chronic respiratory disease. And finally, again, respiratory therapists are educated and trained in all aspects of pulmonary medicine and play a critical role in the treatment of COPD patients. CMS shall conduct an analysis of the most recent claims data of services provided to Medicare beneficiaries with COPD in the emergency department, inpatient and physician office settings, and in long-term care facilities to determine the role of respiratory therapists in improved health outcomes, reduced readmissions, and potential cost savings. So again, everybody will just take a moment to visit this website, capwiz.com/AARC/issues. I would greatly appreciate it. My fellow respiratory therapists would greatly appreciate it. And it will enable us to take better care of those of you living with chronic lung conditions throughout the country. So with all that good stuff out of the way, let's talk about food and other nutrition, of course. Food is a big component of that, but there's some other things that we're going to dive into a little bit today. My own relationship with food has been, shall we say, troubled for a long time. I was not very good at nutrition. I was not very good at eating properly and all that stuff. For a very long time, I was significantly overweight. Morbidly obese is the clinical name for that. Over the last 18 months or so, I have learned a lot about nutrition. My wife, as many of you know, is a nurse practitioner who focuses on bariatric medicine and medical weight loss. And I've been able to learn a lot from her in terms of general nutrition things, and how I think a lot of it is also applicable to the chronic lung disease population, particularly in COPD. It used to be we saw kind of these two main groups in COPD, and we've talked about this a little bit before when we had the chronic bronchitis and the emphysema. We saw kind of the emphysema patients who tended to be short of breath all the time. They tended to lose a lot of weight and get kind of skinny. We called them the pink puffers because they were very, if you look in a medical textbook, you'll kind of see this stereotypical image of a very emaciated, very skinny looking gentleman with a big barrel chest but not much meat on his bones, so to speak. Then we had the other end of the spectrum where we had people with chronic bronchitis who also tended to have maybe some fluid retention, didn't get a lot of exercise, and they tended to put on a lot of weight. And so we still see these two main groups in COPD because we still as far as nutrition goes, because we still have these two big groups where we have nutritional problems in COPD. We have the one group where you have too few calories on intake, and that's important because I was actually just at a conference with my wife. We attended a meeting with one of the medical groups involved, talking about how do we help people lose weight. And at the end of the day, no matter what kind of medical intervention we do or anything like that, a lot of it comes down to calorie deficit or calorie surplus. If you have too many calories, you're going to gain weight. If you have too few, you're going to lose weight. Of course, that's a little bit oversimplified, but at the end of the day, there's a lot of that's kind of basically where we're at. And so we see in COPD we have kind of these two groups also. We have people who take in too few calories because even at rest, people with COPD tend to have higher energy expenditure because it takes much more work to breathe. A lot of you, that's no surprise to, it's not any kind of surprise to a lot of you. It takes, I think the COPD Foundation estimated it takes anywhere from 400 to 700 extra calories than a normal person with relatively healthy lungs just to breathe throughout the day. In addition, we kind of take for granted how much energy it takes to go shopping, to prepare meals, to actually cook the meals, and to actually eat the meals. And so a lot of times when you have chronic lung disease, it's simply too much effort to do a lot of that stuff. You have that excess energy expenditure at baseline, plus you're doing a lot of stuff on top of that. And so you can't take in enough calories to meet all that demand. On the other hand, we have people who are able to take in all those calories who tend to maybe not be quite as breathless at baseline or quite as breathless on a day-to-day basis. But they still don't necessarily have the ability. They're still a little too breathless to get enough exercise. They're still a little too breathless to go out and do the things that they need to do. Maybe start to rely a little bit on the junk food because it's easy to prepare, it's easy to go get, it's easy to eat, and of course you don't get enough exercise. So we have too few calories and too many calories again. And those kind of lead to our big issues. And it's important to consider a lot of this stuff when we're talking about COPD, because when we all know that there are problems with obesity, especially in the United States, but obesity also tends to magnify a lot of the problems that we have with COPD. Carrying around a little too much weight can make it easier for your lungs to get infected, and it can aggravate a lot of the other comorbidities like we talked about last week. And so I kind of came up with a few general rules to try to eat a little bit healthier when you have COPD. For me, and I'll kind of talk about this through the lens of my own experience, for me, protein is one of the main keys to getting involved. Your muscles need protein to grow and develop. Protein can be fairly energy dense. It can be an excellent supply of nutrients and the energy that your body needs to get through the day. I tend to eat because I require a special diet now. And many of you know, my struggle with weight gain kind of took a turn just about a year ago when I had bariatric surgery. I went through a medical weight loss plan before that, and then ended up with having bariatric surgery last May. Since then, I have to eat a fairly high protein diet, at least 60, more preferably 80 grams of protein every day, in order to keep up the mix that my body needs in order to survive, and so I don't become malnourished. So protein is a cornerstone of that. Fat is also a big component of that. For a very long time, fat has kind of been vilified as one of this horrible, terrible, no good things out there in our food. And of course, like anything else, too much fat is going to be bad for you. But fat has kind of gotten a little bit of a bad rap over the years, because as we've gone to a lot of these low fat, no fat, fat reduced things, we've substituted a lot of really awful things in its place. All kinds of sugar, all kinds of salt, a lot of things, because fat is kind of one of the main components of flavor in a lot of our foods. And so when you take the fat out, you have to replace it with something. And we're kind of seeing that the stuff we've replaced fat with is arguably worse than having fat itself. So for my diet, again, I focus on protein. Fat is kind of like the number two, the second tier type of calorie that I take in. And then third is our remaining category of carbohydrates. Some carbohydrates are better than others. Of course, simple sugars are not the greatest thing, and we find a lot of those in our food today. If you really want to open up your eyes, I encourage you to download a food journal app for those of you who are smartphone users, or keep track of this stuff on your computer. There are sites out there. A very good one that I've used a lot is called MyFitnessPal. They have a website and a phone app. And just document the things that you eat every day. It's really easy to do with an app, because a lot of them will use your phone's camera to scan the barcode, or they have a very searchable database of things, even at restaurants, that you can put in there. And you'll really be amazed at the amount of hidden calories that you have in a lot of the food out there, and a lot of the hidden carbohydrates in particular. We sweeten just about everything that you can imagine. Even things that don't even necessarily taste sweet often have a lot of sugars in them, just to kind of amplify their baseline flavor. Now, of course, in the COPD world, we try to avoid a lot of those simple sugars, because unfortunately we see that you get a lot of bloating. They're not very satisfying, and of course they can also exacerbate a lot of the issues with comorbidities, particularly diabetes. And on top of that, they can make it harder to exercise. You kind of have in a lot of sugar, and your insulin kind of rushes out to accommodate all that sugar, and then all of a sudden you have this sugar. Maybe you get a rush for a little while as that sugar is metabolized, and you get a lot of energy, but then you have a huge crash, and then you don't want to exercise. You don't want to get out and do your stuff. And again, of course, we try to talk about exercise a lot as a cornerstone of successful COPD management. Eating a heavy sugar diet can prompt you to eat more sugar. It can be kind of a snowball effect. You want it, you crave it more, and so you eat more. And then, of course, that leads into some of the issues with more bloating and the sugar crash and all that good stuff. So we try to minimize those simple sugars. Trying to make sure the computer doesn't warm up on me too much here. Try to minimize some of those simple sugars so that we can avoid a lot of those complications, and make sure that we're in a good place with exercise and all that stuff. So how do we make accommodations for when you have COPD? We talked a little bit before about it can be a lot. It can be a struggle to cook the meals and prepare the meals and all that stuff. One of the biggest pieces of advice that is often given out is to try to eat more frequent but smaller meals. We want to make sure that calorie intake stays up and you're meeting your base needs, and of course anything you need to get out there and do your pulmonary rehab or your other exercises throughout the day. But we also don't necessarily want to waste a whole lot of oxygen or other resources on digesting a big meal. Anybody who's gone through an American Thanksgiving can probably testify to the fact that as soon as you eat one of those massive meals, you feel really tired. And a lot of times we attribute that to tryptophan in the turkey, but we see the same thing even when we have just a regular old large meal. It takes a lot of effort for your body to digest a large meal. And of course, with chronic conditions like COPD, we don't necessarily have a lot of that effort left to spare. And so if you eat a smaller meal, then you're not necessarily using as much of the exercise to digest stuff, and then you can eat smaller meals throughout the course of a day in order to keep that calorie intake up without using a lot of extra energy to digest it. Another thing that's very important is air swallowing. That's a concern that we have in the bariatric world also. The particular procedure I had was called a gastric sleeve, where they actually removed a big chunk of my stomach, and I have what's left is a sleeve about the size of a banana. We don't want to increase the size of that sleeve because, of course, that takes away a lot of the advantages of using that tool for weight loss. And so I try to minimize air swallowing, because if air gets into that sleeve, it can expand a little bit and it can cause it to stretch out a little bit. In COPD, we have the same thing where maybe you're not as concerned about stretching out your stomach tissue itself, but if you have a big patch of air in your belly, it's going to make it a lot harder for your diaphragm, that muscle that sits right at the bottom of your rib cage, to expand and take a deep breath. A lot of people with COPD already have a lower, flatter diaphragm that's hard enough to expand as it is, and so when you're trying to kind of push that against the balloon, kind of flattens out a little bit, makes it very difficult to get the good air in, the bad air out, and leads to that feeling of shortness of breath. And so we want to try to minimize that, and the best way to minimize that is to try to eat slowly, try to make conscious bites. Don't just, it's real tempting to do that when you get hungry, especially, many of us live very busy lives, trying to get through the day with COPD, or maybe you're breathless, you're short of breath because you've spent the last 45 minutes trying to dice up all the onions and cook this fantastic meal and everything else, and you're drained from all that, you're short of breath, you've got all this stuff going on, and so you just kind of want to scarf down your food, or you're breathing fast while you're eating. That's a perfect recipe for swallowing a lot of air while you're trying to get that food in. That air is going to go right down with the rest of the food and turn into a big bubble in your belly and make it harder for that diaphragm to expand. So slow down, make conscious decisions while you eat, take your time. It's also, for those of you who may be having a little bit of issue with your weight, eating slowly can also help you to lose a few extra pounds if you have pounds to lose, because it's easier for your stomach to signal your brain that you're actually full when you're eating a little bit more slowly. That signal is not the speediest thing in your body, and so it kind of leads us to a tendency to overeat. And also, of course, if you do get breathless while you're eating, instead of trying to scarf everything down or trying to overcome that, take a break for a second. Do some of your breathing exercises, like our old friend the purslet breathing. In through your mouth and nose, and out like you're trying to cool off a spoonful of soup. Help keep those airways stented open, helps you get some of the stale air out, and oftentimes helps you catch your breath. And so we talked a little bit about what we should be eating. We've talked a little bit about what we should be eating in terms of quantities and how to prepare and all that stuff. Things to look out for. We talked a lot about sugar in particular, and making sure we're not taking in too much sugar. Another issue that a lot of people have, especially on the bigger side of things, or if you have comorbidities like congestive heart failure, is salt, or more specifically the sodium that's in salt. Salt is used in probably at least as much stuff as sugar is, especially in commercially prepared meals, because we want to try to get that flavor burst as much as possible. And if you're doing the fast food stuff, they essentially want you to get addicted to that. So the sugar and the salt kind of stimulate a lot of our pleasure centers in the brain and get you craving that kind of food. Unfortunately, water tends to follow salt. So if we take in a lot of salt, our body is going to keep a lot of water on board to try to keep our balance inside the body, help keep our sodium levels in check. And that leads to what we call fluid retention. And if you're the kind of person who's already having some trouble with your heart pumping enough, especially in some of after you've had COPD for a while, and you've developed some of these comorbidities like congestive heart failure, you have that fluid buildup, and if you're trying to throw more fluid on top of that, it can be an even bigger issue, lead to more shortness of breath, lead to a lot more coughing, and sometimes even land you in the hospital. You're going to get a lot of swelling. It's going to be even harder for your heart to pump and all that good stuff. So we really want to try to minimize the amount of salt that we're adding to food, or that we're getting through hidden means that maybe we weren't even aware of. A lot of times we want to keep our salt intake relatively low. Again, the COPD Foundation recommends under about 140 milligrams because we're getting enough salt to kind of keep our muscles going and all that stuff. We're getting enough sodium through regular means. Again, we don't need to add a lot of stuff or eat a lot of prepared stuff. If you're cooking on your own, it's okay, of course, to throw some stuff in there to season to taste. Don't necessarily be afraid of adding salt unless you've been specifically put on a low salt diet. But if you're having prepared foods and you're adding salt to that, you're kind of adding fuel to the fire, and that's going to be a bigger issue down the road. Now, of course, we've talked a lot about how to lose weight or try to cut down on all that stuff. And remember, we have that other group of people who's having a lot of trouble maintaining weight because preparing, shopping, cooking, all that stuff, meal prep, setting the table, everything else is simply consuming too much energy. The easiest way to overcome that is, of course, having somebody help you with a lot of that stuff. Hopefully you have a caregiver / family member / spouse / other family member who can help you with a lot of this stuff, help you do some of the shopping, help you do a lot of the preparing. As far as shopping goes, I know there's some interesting services out there that, for example, in my home state of Michigan, our big chain grocery store called Meijer is testing a shopping service where you submit a catalog of stuff, or you submit a shopping list, and then they'll actually do all the shopping and deliver it to your door. I think there are some other services like that around nationwide in limited areas. The downside to something like that is, of course, it's more expensive. And a lot of people are on a relatively fixed income and can't afford a lot of that extra stuff. And so getting a family member to kind of help you out with a lot of that stuff is, of course, a perfect situation. But, of course, there are situations where you are not able to have a family member help you for a variety of reasons, or you don't want to. And so what can you do to your food to help you add some of those calories? Well, we talked a lot about hidden salt, hidden sugar, all that kind of stuff. You can actually do some of that stuff to your own food if you're preparing it yourself. The COPD Foundation used to have a thing called the Big Fat Reference Guide that they discontinued a little while back in favor of what they now call the Slim Skinny Reference Guides, which are a little bit more targeted and a little bit easier to get to. They have some great tips in there about actually preparing some of your food with some of these hidden ingredients to boost your calorie, especially your fat and your protein intake. For example, a lot of stuff that you cook, you can actually add a pat or two of butter on there and get some of that healthy fat, or at least some fat on board, kind of thicken things up a little bit. Eat things like creamy soups. Make sure you're blending or pureeing some of this stuff. Make sure you cut up your meats, or you use ground meat, that sort of thing, so it's a little bit easier to chew. Focus on things like peanut butter, which also has some good protein and some relatively healthy fats. A lot of other nuts out there are relatively high in calories and are relatively easy to eat. There's some decent, especially if you go with the reduced salt mixes, the nice almonds, cashews, that sort of thing. They can get you some healthy fats, some decent protein, and get you and keep it in a low carb area so that you can keep those air bubbles down and keep that sensation of bloat down a little bit. Along those same lines, you can add protein powder to a variety of drinks. Protein shakes and protein drinks have been kind of a staple of mine for a long time. I start my day, ever since I got back on solid foods after my surgery, I start my day pretty much every day with either a protein drink or a protein powder, a protein bar. I kind of mix it up for a little bit of variety. There are a couple of pre-made things out there. One thing in particular that both my wife and I enjoy is a thing called Isopure. It comes in a ready-to-drink form, or it comes in a powder. The ready-to-drink stuff basically looks like a bottle of juice. It's 20, 24 ounces. Comes in half a dozen different flavors. I like the grape myself. Comes in grape, black tea, green tea. My wife likes the apple flavor. There's a fruit punch, a couple other things like that. Again, ready to drink, a good chunk of protein. I think it's 30 grams of protein. It's a nice start to the day. I do get tired of those flavors after a while, so one thing that I've found works very well is I get the big old jar of protein powder. Again, I like the Isopure brand, but whatever is available in your neck of the woods or works for you is good. It comes in unflavored, and so what I'll do is I'll add some of those like Crystal Light drink packets to a water bottle, put a scoop of the protein powder in there. It's not quite as much protein. I think it's 20 or 25 grams as compared to the 30 or 40 in Isopure ready to drink. But again, it's a good boost to start the day, get some metabolism pumping pretty well, and hits a good chunk of that protein right away. Protein bars are very similar. They tend to be a little bit higher calorie, and they tend to have a little bit higher carbs just because of the way they're made. But there are some decent flavored ones out there. Different textures, different formulations, a lot of different flavors depending on your particular preferences. I tend to like things that are a little bit more crispy, a little bit more, I did before I got the old braces on. I hope to enjoy them again one of these days. But there are chewy ones out there, there are crispy ones out there. Again, they tend to be a little bit higher in carbs just because of the whole process of making an actual bar. But they can also be a very good source of protein. And if you tend to be on that pig puff end of things where you need a little bit more calories, then you can go ahead and choose those unless you're having some trouble with the carbohydrate bloat. One of the more interesting things to come along the line in this area is called the ketogenic diet. I've heard a little bit about this, bits and pieces here and there. And then I had a very interesting web chat with a gentleman by the name of Russell Winwood, who hopefully many of you know as the COPD athlete, who has taken a very scientific approach to trying to figure out what exercise plans and what nutrition plans work best for him. The ketogenic diet is basically founded on the philosophy that if you cut down, and I'm just going to jump in here, my good friend Elena, who used to work with my wife in the bariatrics office and also has a very good interest in nutrition, mentions that Quest bars are the lowest carb, highest protein bar that's out there. They are very good. They tend to be a little bit chewy for me sometimes, but again, a lot of this stuff is personal preference. They have very good flavor, I can tell you that, and so that's definitely an option for you out there. Thank you, Elena, for jumping in there, and also good morning to you and everyone else who has said hello so far today. I hope your days are off to a good start, no matter where you are. But back to the ketogenics. It's an interesting thing. I was talking with Russell about this. For those of you who may not know him, he again is called the COPD athlete, and he's a brand ambassador for Philips, and has traveled extensively promoting COPD awareness and living a good life with COPD. One of the most interesting things he's done to kind of back up his credentials is he ran the New York Marathon last year, despite having what used to be called stage 4, and it's still called by some sources stage 4 COPD. Relatively low lung function, also requires oxygen more often than not, but he's still out there taking care of himself with an exercise and nutrition plan, is planning on running the London Marathon this year and has done a lot of Ironman stuff in between. So he is about the closest thing you have to a COPD nutrition expert in my book. And so we talked a lot about this ketogenic diet, which is formed based on the idea that although your body's primary fuel is usually carbohydrates, if you restrict the level of carbohydrates you take in, you can actually shift your body to start taking to using fat as your primary fuel. And that can be good and that can be bad depending on your body type. It can cause you to lose a lot of weight if you have a lot of fat in your system, if you tend to be obese. But it can be a little bit risky for if you have a couple other medical conditions. And it can change fairly rapid changes in a lot. It can induce fairly rapid changes in a lot of these other symptoms. For example, if you have diabetes, it can rapidly change your resting blood sugar, and so that can cause some effects with your diabetic medications, particularly insulin. If you're taking a daily insulin or a couple other medications. I do know there's a little bit of a risk when you have a particular class of diabetic medications called SGLT2 inhibitors, medications like Farxiga, Invokana, and Invokamet, and Jardiance. It can actually shift you from the ketosis state that you want to be in to a ketoacidosis state that's actually a little bit more dangerous and can be life-threatening if that gets left unattended. So there is a similar situation with blood pressure. It can rapidly drop your blood pressure, and if you don't make the appropriate changes with any blood pressure medication you might be on, it can actually bottom you out a little bit and have lightheadedness and that sort of thing. So it does take some careful monitoring, and it does have some risks to it, but there seem to be some very interesting benefits to the ketogenic diet as well. Again, we're talking about relatively high protein, relatively high fat, which is where we started this whole conversation. And part of that, this whole state of ketosis, where your body is using fat as your primary metabolic fuel, also seems to kind of reduce the level of systemic inflammation or inflammation you have throughout your body. And when you have that, you can reduce some of the inflammation you have inside of your lungs. And that's one of the targets that we're looking at in the COPD world now, to try and improve not necessarily your lung function, but your quality of life, your sensation of breathlessness, and that sort of thing. As you bring down inflammation in your lungs, your airways tend to open up a little bit, and it's easier to move air in and out, which of course reduces the amount of breathlessness you have. It's been shown to do that in rats, and right now Russell is participating in some research that is trying to prove that it happens in humans as well. Again, that is as yet unproven, but it definitely has some potential, and it's a very interesting avenue to research as we're going forward. So, of course, be sure to talk with your doctor before you're switching any kind of nutrition plan or exercise or anything else of that nature to see if there are any other particular concerns to look out for when you're trying to switch to a keto type diet, or even going to a high protein level or anything like that. But these are definitely some things that you can take a look at as you're trying to improve your nutrition and eat to live, so to speak, or eat to breathe, as it might be. The other thing we talk about when we're talking about nutrition is, of course, not only food, but all the vitamins and minerals that you take in as part of food or as a supplementary to that. The biggest ones that we usually talk about in the COPD world are vitamin A and vitamin D. Every few weeks or so, we turn around, one of those articles pops up that says, well, this plant-based vitamin A compound has been shown to improve lung function or to help regenerate lungs, or whatever the claim of the particular week is. Not as commonly do we see that with vitamin D, but of course we've seen that as well. As far as flat out saying that these phenol compounds or these vitamin A compounds are going to work to improve your lungs, that's a little bit far-fetched right now. Right now what we're seeing is that people with low levels of vitamin A and vitamin D seem to be more susceptible to exacerbations, both in quantity and severity. Again, we're not entirely sure why, but that seems to be the case. So these are blood tests that I would recommend anyone living with COPD have. as part of a routine panel, whether it's annually or every 6 months, or however aggressive your particular physician wants to be with that. But it is definitely something that you want to keep an eye on, because if you're deficient, you need to supplement those things to try to minimize the risk of your exacerbations and keep the severity level relatively low. There's not a lot of research to support the use of hypersupplementation or keeping your vitamin A, vitamin D at levels that are considered over normal. It's possible, and we generally don't see any harm in hypersupplementation like that. We just don't necessarily see a lot of benefit either, and so it could just be a waste of money, which again I know is a concern for many people. Things that we don't talk about quite as much but are also important to keep in mind are things like magnesium, which is often low. I think we figure that somewhere between 70 and 80% of Americans tend to have what we consider to be a low level of magnesium from their diet. What magnesium does is it helps your muscles work, basically. It's another one of the fuels that they use to help keep operating. And when we talk about muscles, we're also talking about the muscles that surround your airways, or what we call the bronchial smooth muscles, that help contract to keep pollutants out and that sort of thing, and then expand to help keep your lungs moving properly. And so we want to make sure that your levels of magnesium are working properly, so that you don't clench down those bronchial smooth muscles, and you keep them, the muscles in your lungs, working in an optimum fashion. Of course, it also takes muscles to help you breathe in and out, and we want to make sure the whole muscles of respiration, the whole system of those muscles, is working appropriately. One of the best ways to do that is to keep your magnesium levels within the normal range. Again, not much evidence to support that hyper levels of magnesium are helpful, but we don't want to see a deficit either. Then we also talk about phosphorus and potassium, both of which are very important. Phosphorus levels aren't generally very low, especially with an average diet. Potassium levels, they need to be in a fairly tight range in order to keep your, particularly your cardiac muscles, working appropriately. If we have high or low levels, which are known as hyperkalemia or hypokalemia, we can start seeing some irregular heartbeats in people, which, again, if you have one of the cardiac comorbidities involved in COPD, heart failure, AFib, atrial fibrillation, that sort of thing. If you throw something that causes an irregular heart rate on top of that, obviously you're looking at some major problems. Now, much like phosphorus, potassium, generally we can get enough in our diets, but we do want to eat like green leafy vegetables and that sort of thing. But the biggest issue we see with phosphorus and potassium is that they can be depleted by medications that we commonly prescribe for COPD. And so this is something we want to track on an ongoing basis, to make sure your levels are in the appropriate ranges, so that we're not seeing any more difficulty, we're not making any things harder on you than they have to be. That's kind of the thumbnail sketch. I hope to, one of these days, get my wife on here. Maybe we can talk about some nutrition stuff, or one of the dietitians that my wife works with, who are also excellent resources. Hopefully in your community you can find a good nutritional consultant. If you have any additional questions, there's some decent things online, but you do have to be careful with the source there too, because we kind of get back into some of that snake oil stuff, where we start talking about people who make a lot of claims about how vitamins and minerals and nutrients and plant fibers and blank extract and stevia leaf and whatever, these tincture of so and so. They make a lot of claims that we can cure a lot of things or make things better. You have to be careful with a lot of that stuff, and you have to be careful with a lot of those websites that make those claims. But if you go to fairly reputable sources, things that are endorsed by things like the National Institutes of Health, WebMD is a fairly decent, fairly reliable resource. You can get some more information about nutrition that may be more applicable in your case. But to summarize, mostly the keys, at least in my opinion, are keeping your protein targets up, so you make sure your muscles have the right building blocks they need to get by. Keeping your carbohydrates relatively low. so that you don't get the bloat, you don't have the sugar crashes, and you don't have a lot of the other issues that come along with sugar. And then kind of filling in the blanks with some of the fats, especially the healthier fats as you might find in nuts, peanut butter, and that sort of thing. And then finally making sure that your vitamin and mineral levels are within what we figure to be the appropriate limits for all humankind. So with that, I invite any follow-up questions on there. That's kind of my prepared remarks, as they say, for the day. Certainly willing to entertain the follow-ups on that as much as possible. And of course, this is your time, so we'll welcome any comments from the floor about general COPD questions. Again, I'd like to say good morning to everybody who has thrown in there late. Kathy, thanks for joining us, even if it was a bit late. Of course, if anyone else has joined late today, the video will be available. I've been slacking off a little bit with getting them stuck into the video file. What I'm trying to do is convert some of these into YouTube videos, try to clean up some of the dead space at the beginning, and make them look a little prettier so that they can be a good resource for people, including those people who maybe aren't on Facebook. I did a presentation at a Better Breathers Club the other day, and there were some people who are still Facebook holdouts because of privacy and security concerns, which are totally understandable. And I want to make sure we get this stuff out to as broad an audience as possible. So the videos are available in the group. It might take a little bit of searching, and soon they will be available in a nice central location and also on YouTube. And I'll share that information as it becomes available. So Kim asked, do you know if eating low carb can help your O2 levels? As many people know, many people who live with COPD have chronically elevated levels of carbon dioxide in their bodies. Eating carbohydrates can tend to temporarily raise those CO2 levels. Your body does a pretty good job at maintaining what we call homeostasis, or maintaining your acidity level within a particular range. We target 7.40 on the scale, on the pH scale for anybody who maybe was a chemistry major back in the day or took chemistry in high school. The pH scale is how we measure the relative acidity of particular stuff. And blood wants to be at that 7.4 range for optimal functioning. The biggest driver of chronic CO2 elevation is just keeping that carbon dioxide in your lungs, where it keeps kind of reabsorbing into the bloodstream. When you eat carbohydrates, it can kind of spike that a little bit, and which can also cause shortness of breath as your body is trying to blow off more carbon dioxide in order to recover, get back to that level of homeostasis. Eating low carb, it's hard to say that that's necessarily going to be a driver of long-term CO2 change, but it is probably going to take a little bit of the load off your kidneys, which help also compensate for those periodic spikes in CO2 level, particularly when you're eating carbs. And so it can be helpful on the short term, and to again take some of the load off your kidneys as you're doing that stuff. It's a little less clear whether it's going to help things long term, because again, the retention of carbon dioxide is the biggest driver for those levels. But a great question. Thank you very much. What else we got out there? How's everybody breathing today? We just had a major temperature change here in Michigan, and so I hope springtime is kind of keeping everybody fairly well breathing. I know it's tough in these conditions. Make sure you're wearing your masks and stuff if you're going out in the cold weather. Make sure you're keeping up on any particular allergy medication you might have, as molds and pollens are starting to pop up here and there. And make sure you're taking care of yourself in general. So, Charlotte, is there any way to counteract an increase in appetite from taking prednisone other than plain old self-control and low-calorie foods? It's tough. Self-control is a tough one. That was my biggest issue for a very long time. Prednisone food cravings are also very tough. Anytime we're taking those systemic steroids, we tend to see a lot of cravings. We see an increase in body mass. We see, especially if you're on them for a long time, we see that edema, that swelling. all that stuff. Low-calorie foods are probably the best way to go about that. Sometimes some of this stuff is hard to determine without, and this is something, again, I learned from my wife. We have to have a clear idea. In order to come up with a great plan for your nutrition, we've got to have an idea of what your metabolism is doing. Just like in order to have a great plan for COPD, we kind of need to know through spirometry what your lung and symptom measurements what your lungs are doing. The way we do this is we do a couple different names for it. We do a calorimetry assessment, which again they do in my wife does all the time in the bariatrics office to kind of figure out what your resting metabolism is. I would love to see some more studies out there to see where it is in the COPD world so that we can kind of target nutritional goals for each individual's metabolism. Unfortunately, nutrition has been, as much as we talk about stuff being not covered in COPD a lot, or we don't have a lot of answers for that, nutrition is even later to the party than a lot of the other stuff. And it's not something we necessarily look at when we're talking about a good COPD management plan, but it's definitely something we should be looking at. And it's something I hope to add to the party during the remainder of my career. So it's a very long way to say self-control and low-calorie foods are the best way to go. There are some appetite suppressants on the market. But again, it's going to depend on what some of the other stuff that's going on out there is. If you're also diabetic, you may look at a drug, something along the lines of Victoza or Saxenda. These are medications that are used in the weight loss world. Victoza in particular is one that is targeted at diabetes with the side effect of reducing your appetite. It kind of slows down the food passing through your stomach. And it keeps you fuller longer, and that can cut down on the appetite. That may be something that is an option with long-term systemic steroids, because we also tend to see an uptick in high blood sugar levels, or what we start looking at as those type 2 diabetics. So that can be something that might be an option, but a lot of it is going to depend on what else is out there as far as your comorbidities go. See Elena again today. All natural appetite suppressant fennel seed. Very cool. Chewing the seeds, making a tea, but too much can make you nauseous. I can't help but wonder if that works kind of along the same chemical pathway as some of those drugs like Victoza, which can also make you nauseous, especially if you're eating on top of that. But that's a great tip. I appreciate you bringing in with that. I'll try to keep things, when we're talking about food, the less processed, the less manipulated, the less messed with something is, the better it tends to be for you. Of course, we have to make some accommodations for modern life, and we have a lot of processed foods out there. And again, we have a lot of stuff that we don't even necessarily realize is processed. But the less we can, the more back to nature, so to speak. If we go to farmers markets and get some of those kind of whole foods back in our lives, the better it can be, in my opinion. Fruits, vegetables, fresh is best. Frozen is second best. Canned, a lot of sodium gets added to that, but again, that's an option, especially if we're in off season. So, and we'll try that fennel seed for an appetite suppressant. Bonnie, is there anything we can take for rib cramping? And yes, you talked to the doctor before taking, of course, perfect. Rib cramps can be caused by a lot of different things. Sometimes they're just muscle spasms. Sometimes it can be caused by a vitamin or one of those days, I guess. Mineral imbalance. Sometimes we see muscle cramps with too high or too low sodium, too high, too low potassium. So it'll definitely be one of those things. I know you've done some extensive cardiac testing in the past. But it's definitely one of those things to keep an eye on, especially with COPD and with all the coughing that people tend to do. I know you're one of our vest users too, so you probably tend to have a lot of coughing related to that bronchiectasis / chronic bronchitis stuff going on. It could be, it's one of those, the fancy word for it is multifactorial. There's a lot of stuff that can go into it. So If it is due to a mineral issue, you can obviously take mineral supplementation for that. Get a little bit more potassium in your life, eat a banana here and there, that sort of thing. But again, it's one of those things we kind of have to do trial and error to figure out exactly where it's coming from. Unfortunately, if it's something more like that's due to coughing, a spasm due to coughing, we would be looking at something like a muscle relaxer for that, and that has its own panel of issues that go along with that. So we don't necessarily want to just throw something at the problem and see if it works. We want to try to start working our way up from the bottom and seeing what we can do. One thing that we often talk a lot about, not necessarily in the COPD world, but if we have abdominal pain or chest pain, this was one of those things that I got when you have the bariatric surgery. They give you this big stuffed teddy bear. It's actually very firm. It's similar to a lot of hospitals will give open heart patients a heart-shaped pillow that's fairly firm. You kind of hug it and you cough against that, and it helps. We call it splinting. It helps splint your chest and take some of the load off the muscles in your chest, and give you a little bit more effective cough and take away some of the pain. Kind of spread the load a little bit throughout more of your muscles, and maybe not overwork those muscles that are starting to spasm a little bit. Kathy, clean eating, no preservative, processed food, good veggies, low carb. That's an excellent way to do it. I would suspect that you're seeing pretty good health outcomes from that. If you're willing to share how you're feeling with that, I'm sure a lot of other people would appreciate that. I know it's kind of a cliche, but going back to the foods that Grandma used to make way back in the day before we had a lot of our modern conveniences, they're a great way. People, life expectancy was shorter for other reasons, for illness reasons, but they ate very well. They ate very healthy. Homemade meals that have relatively whole foods are a great way to go about stuff. And again, we might have to make some accommodations for chronic illness and energy levels and all that sort of stuff, but the cleaner the better. Protein drinks for breakfast. What do you eat for lunch and dinner? It's a great question. Fairly normal stuff. Again, I try to eat a lot of protein. I've eaten my level of fish intake has gone up dramatically since surgery. I've always been a fan of seafood, but I've kind of branched out into. I've developed a taste for salmon, which is new for me anyway. A lot of fish, a lot of chicken, still a fair amount of steak and red meat and that sort of thing. But probably fish or chicken are the bigger issues. I have a lot fewer sandwiches for a couple of reasons. First of all, with the smaller stomach, the bread tends to inflate a little bit as soon as it hits the fluids in there, and it takes up a lot of space. And because I know I need to eat that protein first, I prioritize that. So I tend to get one of my favorite meals is either a chicken or salmon Caesar salad. I can I'll eat the protein off of that, and then get the rest of some good fiber and stuff from the protein or the vegetables in there. So again, I try to eat fairly high protein, fairly low carb, fill in the blanks with fat. My dietitian would prefer me to be a little bit more careful with the fat, but I try to stick with healthier stuff like you would get in fish or you would get in nuts and that sort of thing, rather than just the like deep fried fats and that sort of thing. But that's what I do. Eating organic is hard, but it is hard. Crock pot makes it easier for sure. Absolutely. Crock pots are great. You can set it and forget it, basically. I've heard a lot of people talking about this thing called the Instant Pot, which is kind of a crock pot / pressure cooker / rice maker / all kinds of almost like a Swiss Army knife for tools. It cooks things faster because of the pressure cooker aspects of it, but you can also use it as sort of a crock pot kind of deal. Looking at getting one myself. I've heard lots and lots of good things about it. I'm looking forward to trying it out. Kathy lost 10 pounds eating with the clean eating. That's been a big success on my end also. Eating, like I said, the maybe broiled stuff or baked stuff instead of fried things. To me, that's a little bit less processing because it's not dipped in fat and all that stuff. That's the key to a lot of improving the healthier stuff is just that clean stuff and as little alteration as possible. Lena's got an Instant Pot, so maybe she can speak a little bit more to how easy it is to prepare stuff in there. But like I said, I've heard a lot of great things about that. So I'm looking forward to getting one myself and trying it out a little bit. So that brings up another question. Well, people, a lot of you out there are already trying to eat try to get a little healthier on a lot of stuff, trying to eat a little bit better. What's working for you? Do you have little packages of prepackaged snacks, like prepackaged trail mix with different kinds of nuts? The little peanut butter snacks, maybe a little cup of peanut butter with some celery, kind of the old school children's snacks, the ants on the log, that sort of thing. If anybody wants to share what works for them, that would be great. Also, greetings to Linda McMahon checking in with us today, one of our leading alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency advocates here in Michigan. Linda's putting on a golf outing later this year to raise awareness and raise funds for alpha-1 research. So we're trying to support that effort as much as possible. Smaller plates, yep. It's funny. That's kind of one of the psychological things that we don't talk about a lot. When you have a big dinner plate full of stuff, especially if you're going to a buffet or something like that, you tend to fill it up Whether we're home, whether we're at a meal, we want to see that full plate. So if you use a smaller plate, it fills up a lot faster. And especially if you're hitting that protein, maybe you're getting that chicken breast on there, or that whatever kind of cut of chicken you like on there. You fill the plate up with your protein, then maybe have a little bit of potato and some vegetable and stuff like that, and get some of the other stuff. Your plate's going to fill up a lot faster, but if you're focused on that protein stuff, then you're going to be able to hit calorie goals a little bit better, but hit some of those healthier calorie mix a little bit easier also. 7 colors a day is a good way to look at that. It's hard for a lot of people, especially maybe in the winter months when you don't have necessarily as much access to fresh fruits and vegetables and that sort of thing. But that is a great thing to come on there. The different colors represent different nutrients and things like that. I know we tend to hit like green leafy vegetables all the time, but you get a lot of good stuff from carrots, you get a lot of good stuff from eggplant, you get a lot of good stuff from the other colors as well. Any of my colleagues doing live sessions for other conditions? Not that I know of offhand. My colleagues tend to fairly well focus on the lung stuff. I would have to imagine there's other people out there doing some kind of stuff. But if I come across anything, I'll be sure to try to spread the word with that. I tend to think these live sessions go great for a lot of chronic, especially chronic diseases, diabetes management, heart condition management, lung management, arthritis, all that kind of stuff. And that is, I'm going to segue into this again real quick. That's why telehealth is so important. Again, this particular issue is specifically for COPD and chronic lungs, but telehealth is a great resource for a lot of people in areas where they don't necessarily have ready access to a physician, can't get to the doctor's office. Maybe the doctor's 45 minutes away in their local big city. A telehealth program where you can have electronic communication and interaction right in the home is invaluable. And so we're hoping to see that expand in the next few years. And so any bit of advocacy that you guys can help us with, whether it's for lungs or whether it's for any other chronic condition, we'd certainly appreciate that. Rose, hey Rose, small meals per day, so I'm never hungry, eat only good stuff, protein, like you say. Yeah, exactly. Again, those small meals can be a lot easier to digest. Eating 6 small meals rather than 3 large meals is going to be a little bit easier for you to cope with. Might be a little bit more prep work, but a lot of times you can do some of those healthier snacks, like you can take 5 minutes and make 3 baggies worth of nuts, or 3 baggies worth of, or 3 sets of hummus and some carrots, or peanut butter and celery, or a lot of that stuff. It takes 5 minutes to prepare those things. You can just grab and go throughout the day instead of going for that candy bar or that Rice Krispie treat from the vending machine or something like that. That can be very helpful in eating a good balance of calories, a good balance of nutrients, and also keeping things easy. James, another vote for MyFitnessPal. A dear friend got you started. It's great to hear. A dear friend who I like to call my wife, Kelly Becker, got me started on MyFitnessPal. I believe that's the preferred tool in their office for management, for nutritional management. I know a couple of the other ones out there. Spark People is a good one. That's one that we started on way back in the day. MyFitnessPal is great because it also interfaces with a lot of stuff like your Fitbit. If any of you are out there counting steps, keeps track of your. I've been neglecting that lately, I'm sorry to say, but hopefully with the nicer weather coming, we're really looking forward to getting out and walking more in the fresh air and sunlight. Interfaces with, like I said, things like Fitbit, things like you can keep track of your steps on it, you can keep track of your nutritional intake on it, set goals, you can track your water intake with that, you can track all kinds of stuff with that. And so MyFitnessPal kind of becomes a bit of a hub for your whole nutritional aspect. For those of you who are a little bit more intense in your exercises, they also have a program, the same company, Under Armour. It is sponsored by a company, I should put that out there. Under Armour also makes Map My Walk, which we do if you're a runner or walker. You can keep track of your exercise path. It's enabled with GPS, and it helps keep track of the calories an estimate of the calories you're expending as you do that, and then that all feeds into MyFitnessPal and keeps track of all that stuff for you. MyFitnessPal does have a paid subscription. I haven't heard a lot of the benefits to doing the paid stuff. You can get 90% of what you need, if not more, just through the free version. Just switching to healthier eating, juicing in the morning. That's something that I actually had planned on touching on and kind of forgot. Juicing can be very good. You do have to be a little bit careful because when you're juicing, you're getting a lot of the sugars from the individual fruits. You know, again, when you eat, say an apple is a good example of this. When you're eating an apple, you eat an apple. You get some of the juice, but you're also getting a lot of the fiber, especially in the skin and things like that. When you're juicing, you're kind of squeezing out all the juice, and you're probably getting some of the calories and the sugar from, not being a juicer myself, I don't know exactly, but maybe you're getting like 6 apples in there. And so you're getting a little bit more of the concentrated sugar and maybe not quite as much of the good stuff. So if you're supplementing that with some of the leafy vegetables and things like that, that's probably the ideal thing. If you're strictly going with the juice, you just have to be careful about the sugar intake there. Again, it's a relatively healthy sugar, but too much of it is still going to be less of a good thing. The other thing that a lot of people do, and this is kind of where you can tie in with fairly easy prep, but good protein, is make yourself a smoothie. You can get a lot of those similar to juicing. You can get the veggies in there, you get some of the leafy stuff in there, get some of the protein powder, some of the probiotic stuff like some Greek yogurt. Get a good flavorful thing with good protein that's going to be fairly easy to consume and digest. Obviously, you don't really, if you're chewing a smoothie, you're doing it wrong. So it's going to be easy to ingest and then easy to digest. And you get that good mix of nutrients and vitamins and minerals and all that kind of stuff on there. Excuse me. I've been reading a lot lately on the dangers of ice cubes. My thoughts on that. Well, you certainly don't want to slip on them. You don't want to aspirate them. Beyond that, I haven't really... if you would be a little bit more specific, Bonnie, I would appreciate that. I haven't really heard a lot of the dangers of ice cubes, again, other than kind of the silly stuff I was just talking about. So we'll get back to that one in a minute if you can highlight maybe one of the dangers you've heard about. To your other question, why do many of you cough when you eat something cold? A couple of reasons for that. Depending on how cold it is, the initial thing that happens is you're actually coughing because when you breathe in cold air, especially when you breathe in through your mouth, you're kind of bypassing your natural heating and humidification system. Your nose is actually filled with a lot of blood vessels and a lot of other stuff through your nose and your sinus, and as it's very warm and very humid in there. And so when you breathe in through your nose, it warms up. Your air has to get to a certain humidity and a certain temperature before it hits your lungs. And so when you breathe in through your nose, you're very actively humidifying and heating a lot of that stuff before it gets down there. When you breathe in through your mouth, you bypass a lot of that. And of course, you get some heat and some humidity from the blood vessels that are in your tongue and the top of your throat and all that stuff. But when you get in air that's too cold, your body's immediate response is to kind of spasm down and prevent that from getting into your lungs, because you can cause damage that way. And so when you inhale over the top of, say, an ice cube or something very cold, you're getting a big bolus of that cold air, and your body doesn't like that. So it kind of reacts to that by clenching down and coughing and trying to get that cold air back out. So that would be my initial suspicion for why that stimulates a cough response in most people. Hey Terry, how you doing today? How's Texas treating you? Going back to the ice cubes, restaurants not cleaning ice makers. That is a danger, of course. Bacteria can grow in spaces that are left to, a lot of ice makers tend to be kind of warm, and maybe they're not cleaned as well as they should be. And so bacteria, it can be a very rich environment for bacteria to grow. Hopefully your local health inspectors are doing an adequate job of taking care of that. We actually had for whatever reason, our local media decided to highlight the monthly restaurant reports from the local health inspectors, and so I was reading that out of kind of some morbid curiosity, and it did hit the ice makers and the pop machines and that sort of thing. A lot of places maybe they weren't cleaned quite as well as they should be, but they were dinged right away from the health inspector, and they had to, the stuff got treated pretty much immediately, and then a follow-up inspection and stuff was clear. So, I hesitate to jump on restaurants right away. I do think in general, health inspectors do a pretty good job of protecting us from that sort of thing. And sometimes those dangers are a little bit overblown by the media, because everybody knows they like to get eyeballs on their websites and their ratings up and all that stuff. It is a risk, certainly. How much of a risk it is, of course, it's going to depend on the restaurant. It's going to depend on some of the other factors. It's going to depend on your sensitivity to that particular breed of bacteria, and it's going to depend on whether everybody's doing their job or not. So I would be reluctant to call that like an outbreak or a super high risk or anything like that, but certainly something to be cautious about. Sometimes ice does taste musty, so do the bag salads. And again, we're running into that same thing. If food isn't kept at an appropriate temperature for storage or isn't cooked to a particular temperature, we've got a risk of various foodborne illnesses there. My gut would say that that's probably a greater risk than some of the ice stuff, but again, it's going to depend on where you are and how everything is going in your particular community. Breathing in cold air from the CPAP causes you to spasm. I can't stand that. I can certainly understand where you're coming from there. If you're getting cold air from your CPAP machine, I would be concerned that there's something wrong with it, or that your humidity isn't set, your humidifier isn't set properly. I always encourage people to use a humidifier with their CPAP. I've tried a couple of times without it, and the air is just too dry in general for me. One of the nice things about humidifiers is they actually do add some heat to the incoming air also. And so I would fiddle around with your settings a little bit before anything else, but if you can't get to where your humidifier settings are making it comfortable for you, and at least making it so you're not coughing all the time, I would suspect that there's maybe an issue with the unit. We do see humidifiers, they're like any other kind of equipment. They malfunction after a while. They have a certain life expectancy. Some of them break, just like a computer or a car or anything else. They can break down at any particular time. So try to change your settings a little bit. If that's not working, contact your DME supplier where you got your CPAP machine. Say, hey, something's not right here. I'm not getting the right level of humidity. I'm not getting the right level of heat from there. I think something might be broken, and they should be able to fix that up for you. So we got a few more minutes. Like I said, I know we started late. I don't remember exactly when things quite kicked off, but I'm certainly happy to keep the floor open for a little bit. This has been an interesting talk, and I'm glad to see our numbers are back up a little bit from last week. I don't think people like talking about the comorbidities. Wasn't very interesting for a lot of people maybe, but this week we're hitting nutrition. Next week I believe we're talking about exercise for a little bit. Come April, things are going to be a little bit clogged up. I know I've got a couple talks on the agenda already. I am going to be the Wednesday, April 5th. We've got a talk scheduled. The topic's evading me off the top of my head right now. That is also the start of our Michigan Society for Respiratory Care conference. So that day, maybe over the course of the next couple of days, I would hope to have a couple of live sessions. Probably short ones, not quite an hour long, where we can talk about some COPD stuff or maybe get some enlightenment. I'm going to be speaking a little bit about what we're doing at our COPD clinic here at the medical school. We're going to have a couple other talks about the future of outpatient treatment, respiratory care, treating chronic disease as more of a disease management thing rather than just seeing you in the hospital. Very similar to that, a couple weeks after Michigan, I'm going down to Tennessee and doing a very similar talk down there, talking about our group, COPD Navigator, and how social media has been a very positive influence for a lot of people. Coming up in May, we'll be doing our annual sort of quality control and interest study in the group, seeing, kind of keeping track of, we're coming up on our 3rd year anniversary for COPD Navigator, and excited to see sustained development in how people are feeling about their COPD and their level of knowledge about COPD, because one of the best things we've done in the group, hopefully, is to keep people engaged and interested in their own care and to empower you to have the questions that you need to ask your doctor to take the best care of you and get you on the right treatment plan. Linda, we do these at noon Eastern time. Every Wednesday. The live talks are during this time now. Again, this one was delayed a few minutes. One of the things I'm very hopeful on, we're going to be, we're very interested in doing some research here in the clinic. And as I mentioned, I spoke this morning with Dr. Brian Type, who has been a huge proponent of outpatient management. He's out west somewhere. I don't remember exactly where he is. I think maybe out in California. I met him a couple of years ago at a conference in Miami. He does some very interesting things. I know he's got some YouTube videos out there too about COPD management. He talks a lot about having daily rituals and keeping your pulse ox handy and all that stuff, and catching exacerbations right at the beginning of stuff. He likens it to a wildfire where an exacerbation or a flare, if you catch it early, you use a little bit of water to put it out and nothing bad happens. If you don't catch it, then it kind of flares up into this whole big mess that you need to call the fire jumpers in for. He and then Dr. Brian Carlin out of Pittsburgh, again, very involved in COPD continuum of care from inpatient to outpatient. We're hoping to get them on board with developing a research study to help show that we're keeping people out of the hospital to begin with, and if you do end up there, we have enough quality control to keep you from going back in. So that's why we started late today, hoping to add that on sometime this year into our clinic. But of course, that's a key aspect of COPD Navigator, our Facebook group also. So I invite anybody who's not already a member of that to join us there and get some good support and some good information. We're in Tennessee, in Nashville. One of the hotels, not Opryland, but one of the hotels downtown Nashville there, sort of near the river. Again, the name of it is not jumping to mind right now, but one of the actual convention centers right there. I'll be there April 20th, I believe is the exact date. April 20th and 21st. Speaking about COPD Navigator and how we can try to improve COPD care in the outpatient world. I will definitely love to come to California, talk to the Kaiser Foundation. Kaiser's been doing a lot of very interesting things in healthcare in general for the past few decades. Big fan of the Kaiser Family Foundation, a lot of the research that they do into the economics of healthcare and economics of healthcare delivery. So I would certainly be honored if you think my talks would be helpful. Please feel free to throw my name out there to any physician who might be putting groups together. I do have a few friends at the California Society for Respiratory Care. I'm sure they would be also happy to come and speak. And hopefully I can talk them into bringing me out there to talk at one of their conventions before too long. So, Nurse also touched on breathing exercising this week, adding that to newer, healthier lifestyle. Yep, I'm a big proponent of learning wherever you can, and from whoever you can learn from, as long as, again, you're being careful that it's a legit person and not somebody who's just trying to take advantage or steal your money or promote a particular agenda or anything like that. Whether it's a nurse, a respiratory therapist, a doctor, whoever you want, a Facebook group, anything like that. As long as you've got some good evidence-based knowledge behind you, then you're learn from wherever you can learn from. Whether it's our group, another group, anybody out there. Learn all that is learnable, as they say. About 4 hours east of Nashville. Well, this one might not be one where we can cross paths, but again, I encourage anybody to seek out any kind of, I know the ALA, the American Lung Association, puts on a lot of lung force expos at various sites across the country. Participate in those. COPD 10 USA coming up in the Chicago area. We've talked about that several times. Patients obviously welcome to participate in that. In Indianapolis this October, the AARC is going to be having a patient summit again in conjunction with our national conference. The more that the patient voice is heard in healthcare, the more effective we're going to be. I think that's a big component of what's called the Healthcare 3.0 movement. If anybody out there, there's a great physician. He started off in primary care, and now he does a lot of advocacy. His name is Zubin Damania. He's out in Las Vegas. He goes by Z-Dog MD. He's often called the Weird Al Yankovic of the medical field because he's a very witty gentleman, very personable gentleman. He makes a lot of music videos, song parodies to promote a lot of causes out there. He's made one called about sleep apnea, called Snore. That's basically Katy Perry's Roar. If any of you are current pop fans. He's done stuff about antibiotic resistance, vaccinations, all kinds of stuff. Hopefully we can get him do one on COPD before too long. But my point is he's a great advocate for what we call the Healthcare 3.0 movement, which is much more focused on delivering care at the right time to the right people in the right method, rather than worrying about what's getting paid for and all that other stuff. So patient-centered care is a big part of this Healthcare 3.0 movement, and I want as many people involved in that as we possibly can. So come to Knoxville next time. I would love to come over to Knoxville. The last time I was in Tennessee was actually when I was a kid. We went to Gatlinburg and Pigeon Forge, which was an interesting experience. Didn't quite make it into Dollywood, but Gatlinburg and Pigeon Forge were pretty cool on their own, especially to, I was probably 10 years old at the time or so. So that was a great experience. Loved Tennessee. Love that whole area down there. I'm happy to come back anytime I have the opportunity. So, with that, and with my little soapbox about 3.0 and all that stuff, unless there's any other questions anybody wants to throw out there, I think we'll bring this one to a close. Hope everybody enjoyed it. Hope everybody got some good information about how to eat a little bit healthier, at least, on what things we can focus on as we're going forward. Looking forward to having a good week on my end. Hope you're looking forward to a good week on your end. Hope everybody is staying healthy and breathing easier as we work through this transition in the seasons. And hopefully we'll see everybody in a week or so. Again, last pitch, promote telehealth. Talk to your elected representatives for getting respiratory therapy involved in telehealth, and getting some more information about how we can help Medicare improve COPD management. And it can be a win-win for everybody and get everybody on board. So thank you very much. Have a breathe easy week, and we'll see you all next time.